My name is Thomas Bradshaw, and the afternoon my son found out what was actually written in my will was also the afternoon I finally understood that showing up for most of his adult life had never once been something he considered non-negotiable. We were sitting in Sandra Pierce's office on the third floor of a bank building downtown, the kind of office with a view of the Ohio River and a leather couch nobody ever actually sits on. Sandra had been my estate attorney for 11 years, ever since Nancy first suggested we get our affairs in order the year I turned 63, and she had the calm, unhurried manner of a woman who had read 1,000 wills out loud to 1,000 families and had long since stopped being surprised by how people reacted to them. I'd asked for what Sandra called a living disclosure, a chance to walk my son through the will while I was still around to explain my reasoning, rather than leaving him to read it cold after I was gone. I'd read about the practice years earlier in a magazine in a doctor's waiting room, families choosing transparency over ambush, and something about it had appealed to me the moment my own health started to turn. I didn't want my last communication with my son to be a document. I wanted it to be a conversation, however hard that conversation turned out to be. Kyle sat across the desk from me in a suit that cost more than my old service revolver, checking his phone twice before Sandra had even opened the folder, and I remember thinking, watching him do that some habits get so deep in a person they stop even noticing they're doing them anymore. Sandra read through the preliminary sections first, the standard language, the appointment of executor, which she'd already told me she planned to name jointly between Kyle and my longtime attorney's office, a compromise I'd insisted on to give my son real responsibility, even where I'd made other decisions he might not like. Kyle nodded along through that part, only half listening, the way you listen to instructions you assume won't matter much to you personally. Then Sandra got to the specific bequests. To my son, Kyle Thomas Bradshaw, I leave the property at 4118 Hillcrest Avenue. She read, along with the contents therein, and an amount of $400,000 from my investment accounts to be distributed upon my passing. Kyle's posture eased slightly. That was the house he grew up in, the account he probably already had a rough estimate of in his head. He nodded, satisfied, waiting for the rest to be a formality. To Jason Michael Cole, Sandra continued, and I watched my son's face change before she'd even finished the sentence. I leave the remaining balance of my pension survivor benefits, my life insurance policy in the amount of $500,000, and full decision-making authority as trustee over the Michael Cole Memorial Fund for Firefighters' Families, which I have funded with an additional $320,000 from the sale of my commercial rental property on Reading Road. Kyle sat completely still. Who, he said slowly, is Jason Cole? Sandra glanced at me, and I nodded for her to keep reading, though I could feel my own pulse picking up in my ears. Additionally, Sandra continued, all department memorabilia, including my badge, my helmet, and my service medals, are to be donated to the Cincinnati Fire Museum in honor of firefighter Michael Cole, who gave his life in the line of duty on October 14, 2004. Kyle turned to me, and the look on his face was one I hadn't seen since he was a teenager caught in a lie he couldn't talk his way out of. Dad, who is this person getting more than $500,000 out of your estate? I've never even heard that name before in my life. I looked at my son across that desk, and I understood, in that moment, that everything I was about to explain to him should have been explained years earlier, in 100 smaller conversations I'd let slide instead, because I'd assumed there would always be more time to have them. His name is Jason, I said quietly. His father died saving my life 20 years ago, and I've been keeping a promise to that man ever since, one I don't regret for a single second, even knowing how this moment was going to land on you. Kyle sat back in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes still fixed on me. You skipped telling me about this the same way you've apparently been skipping telling me about a whole life I never knew existed. I want to tell you how we got to that office, because the will Sandra read that afternoon didn't start with a lawyer's folder. It started 20 years earlier, in a burning house on Melrose Avenue, and it wound its way through a funeral planning meeting my son never showed up for before it ever reached that desk with the river view. I joined the Cincinnati Fire Department in 1974, 22 years old, 6 months married to a woman named Nancy who used to tell people, only half joking, that she'd married a house on fire before she ever fully understood what that meant for the rest of her life. I spent 36 years on that job, working my way up from a rookie, riding the back step to captain of Engine Company 14 by the time I retired in 2010. It was the only career I ever wanted, the only identity I ever really felt fit me the way it was supposed to. And Nancy supported every double shift, every missed birthday, every 3 a.m. phone call, without once making me feel like I owed her an apology for the life I'd chosen. We had one son, Kyle, born in 1982, and I want to be honest that fire department schedules are hard on families in ways that don't always show up until years later. I missed a lot growing up with Kyle, not out of neglect, but out of the simple math of a job that runs on a rotating schedule nobody else's life fits around. I missed 2 of his birthdays to structure fires. I missed most of his Little League season one year to a stretch of mandatory overtime during a particularly brutal summer for wildfires spreading into the outskirts of the county. Nancy used to tell me, gently, that Kyle understood, that he was proud of what I did even when he didn't say it out loud. I believed her, mostly, because believing her was easier than sitting with the alternative. Kyle grew up, went to Ohio State on a partial academic scholarship, studied finance, and built a career in wealth management that had him, by his late 30s, managing portfolios for people whose net worth made my entire pension look like pocket change. I was proud of him. I want to say that plainly, the same way I've said it about every kid in these kinds of stories, because it's true, and because pride and distance can exist in the same house without either one canceling out the other. Kyle married Vanessa, a marketing director at a firm downtown, and they built a life in a subdivision on the east side of the city, a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like the kind of success a man might hope for his son. What that life didn't have much room for, over the years, was me. Visits shrank from monthly to quarterly to whatever holiday actually made the calendar. Phone calls became texts. Texts became increasingly brief. I never held it against him out loud because I told myself, the same way most fathers in my position probably tell themselves, that busy adult children are simply the natural cost of raising them well enough to build their own full lives. Mike Cole joined my crew at Engine 14 in 1988, a broad-shouldered kid from the West Side with more raw courage than sense. In his first year, the kind of firefighter who ran toward structures the rest of us were still sizing up from a safe distance. Over the years, Mike settled into one of the steadiest, most reliable partners I ever worked beside, the kind of man you'd trust with your life because you'd already tested that trust more times than either of you could count. We rode the same rig for 16 years. Our families grew close the way fire department families often do, holiday cookouts, kids growing up together at the same picnic tables, wives who became each other's closest friends through the shared experience of loving men who ran into buildings other people were running out of. Mike's son Jason was born the same year as Kyle, and the two boys grew up practically as brothers for a while, before the natural drift of adolescence and different schools pulled them in separate directions. Jason used to come by the firehouse on weekends, sitting in the kitchen while Mike and I cooked for the shift, asking endless questions about the trucks, the gear, the calls, the same kind of curious that you can't teach into a kid. They either have it or they don't. October 14th, 2004, started as an ordinary structure fire call, a 2-story house on Melrose Avenue. Working fire on arrival, nothing our crew hadn't handled 100 times before. I went in on the second floor to search a bedroom where a neighbor reported a possible occupant still inside. The floor gave way beneath me faster than any of us expected, the fire having compromised the joists more severely than the initial assessment suggested, and I went through, into the space below, disoriented, out of air faster than I should have been, pinned partially beneath debris in a way that made it difficult to move. Mike came through after me. I don't remember much of what happened in the actual moment, the way most people don't remember the worst seconds of their lives with any real clarity. What I know, because 3 other firefighters on scene that day told me afterward, piece by piece over the years since, is that Mike found me, cleared the debris enough to free my leg, and pushed me toward the opening he'd come through, staying behind himself for the few extra seconds it took to make sure I was clear before the section of ceiling above us gave way entirely. I made it out with a broken leg and smoke inhalation that kept me in the hospital for 4 days. Mike didn't make it out at all. I spent those 4 days in a hospital bed, unable to fully process what had happened, in and out of consciousness from the smoke, and by the time I was lucid enough to understand fully, Mike had already been gone 2 days, and Jason, 17 years old, had already had to sit through the worst 48 hours of his young life without his father in it. I went to that funeral on crutches, against doctor's orders, because there was no version of my recovery that mattered more than standing in that room for Mike Cole. I remember Jason standing at the front of the church, 17 years old, wearing a suit that clearly belonged to someone else, too big in the shoulders, his mother beside him, looking like she'd aged a decade in 2 days. I remember thinking, watching that boy stand there, that I owed him something I didn't yet have words for, something bigger than sympathy, something closer to a debt I intended to spend the rest of my life repaying. I never got the chance to hear Mike's own last words, the way some men do in these stories, because Mike didn't have time for last words. The fire took that from both of us. But I made my own promise anyway, standing at that funeral on crutches, a promise I never announced to anyone, that Jason Cole would never go through the rest of his life without someone in it who remembered exactly what his father had done and exactly what it had cost. Jason struggled for a while after his father's death, the way any 17-year-old would struggle losing a parent that suddenly, that violently. His mother, Denise, held the family together as best she could, but grief has a way of taking up space in a house that nothing else quite fills. I started showing up on weekends, first just to check in, then increasingly to actually be present in the boy's life in whatever way he'd let me. I taught him to change his own oil in my driveway, the same way you'd teach any kid whose father wasn't around to do it. I sat in the stands for his high school wrestling matches, on the same side as the handful of other parents who bothered to come, because Denise worked double shifts at the hospital most of that season just to keep the household running. When Jason turned 18 and told me he wanted to follow his father into the fire service, half the adults in his life tried gently to talk him out of it, worried, understandably, about asking a family to survive that particular loss twice. I told him the opposite. I told him I thought Mike would have been prouder of that decision than almost anything else Jason could have chosen, because Mike spent his whole career running toward danger to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. And it made a strange, aching kind of sense that his son would want to carry that same instinct forward instead of running from it. I mentored Jason through the fire academy myself, unofficially, sitting with him at my kitchen table, quizzing him on hydraulics, and building construction the same way I once quizzed rookies half my life earlier. I was there the day he graduated, sitting in the audience not because anyone expected the retired captain to show up, but because I'd made a promise on crutches at a funeral 15 years earlier, and some promises don't have an expiration date. Jason made captain himself eventually, at Engine 14, my old company, a coincidence neither of us had engineered, but that felt, to both of us, like something closer to inheritance than chance. Every couple of weeks for the last 15 years, Jason has shown up at my house unannounced with a six-pack or a toolbox or both, checking in on the old captain the same way I used to check in on him as a grieving teenager. He knows which drawer holds the good scissors. He knows my coffee maker sticks unless you flip the switch twice. He has kept a set of my house keys since he was 23 years old, and in all that time, he has never once used them for anything except letting himself in to fix something before I even knew it was broken. Kyle has never had a key to my house. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it's true and because it matters to what happened next. Nancy passed 8 years ago, a stroke that took her quickly, mercifully quickly, compared to some of the ways I'd watched other men lose their wives over the years, but no less devastating for the speed of it. I won't pretend that loss didn't change something in both Kyle and me. For me, it went quiet, the same quiet that had settled over me once before, briefly, in that hospital bed after Melrose Avenue, a quiet I recognized immediately when it came back around. For Kyle, grief went the opposite direction, toward distance, toward busyness, toward a calendar that filled itself up with things that always seemed, on paper, more urgent than a Tuesday phone call to his father. I never held that against him, not out loud, the same way I never held anything against him out loud, because good fathers, I kept telling myself, don't keep score. I understand now that not keeping score out loud isn't the same thing as not keeping score at all, and somewhere over those 8 years, some part of me had been quietly tallying every missed call, every rescheduled visit, every holiday that turned into a video call instead of a drive across town, without ever fully admitting to myself that I was doing it. 3 years ago, at a routine physical, my doctor found something in an EKG that led to a cardiology referral, which led to a diagnosis of congestive heart failure, moderate at first, progressing over the following 2 years to a stage that made both my cardiologist and me start having conversations we'd both been quietly avoiding. I want to be clear that I'm still here, still living, still capable of a full life within the limits the condition puts on me. But a diagnosis like that has a way of clarifying a man's priorities in a hurry, and mine clarified around one specific fear, that I might die the way too many people do, leaving behind a house full of unfinished business, and a family forced to sort through my intentions without ever having heard them from me directly. I called Sandra Pierce about 18 months ago and told her I wanted to get everything in order while I still had the clarity and the time to do it properly. Sandra had handled small estate matters for families across this county for almost 30 years, and she'd seen enough sudden, chaotic aftermaths to have strong opinions about the alternative. Most people wait until it's too late to have any real say in how the conversation happens, she told me during our first meeting. You've got the rare chance to actually be in the room for it. I'd encourage you to take that chance seriously. We spent almost a year working through the details, careful, deliberate, nothing rushed. I told her about Mike Cole early in that process, about the promise I'd made on crutches at a funeral, about the 15 years of quiet mentorship that had followed. Sandra listened without judgment, the way she always did, and helped me think through what a fitting honor to that debt might actually look like on paper. You could set something up that doesn't touch what you're leaving your son at all, she suggested at one point. A separate memorial fund, funded through additional assets, that doesn't come at Kyle's expense. I've thought about that, I told her, but I want Jason to have real authority over it, not just a symbolic gift. He's the one who actually understands what these families go through. He should be the one deciding how it's used. We settled eventually on the structure Sandra read out loud in that office months later. Kyle would inherit the house, the family home, and a substantial cash inheritance, more than enough to secure his own family's future many times over. Jason would inherit the pension survivor benefit, which otherwise would have simply lapsed since Nancy had already passed, along with a life insurance policy I'd specifically increased over the last decade for exactly this purpose, and trusteeship over a memorial fund built from the sale of a commercial property I'd bought decades earlier as an investment, one that had nothing to do with the family home or any asset Kyle had grown up believing was part of his inheritance. I want to be honest that I debated more than once whether to tell Kyle about any of this before it was finalized. Every time I picked up the phone to call him, some old wound stopped me, some quiet accumulation of years of missed calls and rescheduled visits that made me want to see, this time, whether Kyle would show up for a conversation this important without me having to chase him down first. I got my answer 3 months before that meeting in Sandra's office, at a conference room table at the funeral home on Montgomery Road, in a scene that told me almost everything I needed to know before Sandra ever opened her folder. Ed Whitfield had run Whitfield Family Funeral Home for almost 40 years, and I'd known him personally since he'd handled Mike Cole's service back in 2004. When my cardiologist and I had our first serious conversation about the trajectory of my condition, I decided, the same way I decided to get my legal affairs in order, that I wanted to plan my own funeral arrangements in advance, both to spare Kyle the burden of doing it under duress later, and because I had specific requests about the department honor guard, about certain hymns Nancy had loved, about a graveside service instead of the more elaborate options Ed's catalog offered, that I wanted to make sure were honored exactly the way I intended. I called Kyle 3 weeks before the scheduled meeting and told him plainly what it was for. I want you there, son. This matters to me. I want to walk you through what I'm arranging, so none of this is a surprise to you later. Of course, Dad, he said, in the easy, distracted way he said most things those days. Just send me the date. I sent him the date. I sent him a reminder a week before. I sent him another reminder 2 days before, because some old instinct told me not to fully trust the first two. The Thursday of the meeting arrived, a gray October afternoon, close enough to the anniversary of Mike Cole's death that I'd noticed the date on my own calendar without meaning to. I arrived at Whitfield Family Funeral Home 15 minutes early, the way I've arrived early to almost everything in my life, a habit 36 years on a fire department schedule never quite let go of. Ed met me in the lobby, shook my hand warmly, the particular warmth of a man who has sat across from grieving families for 4 decades and never lost the human instinct underneath the professional one. Tom, good to see you. Is your son parking? Should be here any minute, I said. We sat in Ed's conference room, a comfortable space with soft lighting and boxes of tissues placed with quiet, practiced discretion on every surface, and waited. At 2:05, 5 minutes past our scheduled start, my phone buzzed. A text from Kyle: Dad, so sorry. Got pulled into an emergency call with a client. Market's doing something crazy today. Can we push this to next week? I looked at that message for a long moment. I thought about the 3 weeks of notice I'd given him, the 2 reminder texts, the specific date I'd chosen carefully around my own cardiology follow-up schedule so that this wouldn't conflict with anything on my end. I typed back, "This is important, Kyle. Can you step away for even 20 minutes? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, I really can't right now. I'm sorry. This client's portfolio is down 6 figures today, and I have to manage this personally. We'll reschedule. I promise." I put the phone face down on the conference table. Ed, watching my face, didn't say anything right away. The way a man who has spent 40 years reading grief on people's faces knows exactly when silence is the more respectful choice. At 2:20, the conference room door opened, and Jason Cole walked in, still in his uniform pants, though he'd changed out of his duty shirt, having come straight from a shift change at Engine 14. "Captain Bradshaw, sorry I'm a little late. Had to swing by the station first." I stared at him. "How did you know to come?" He looked a little confused. "You mentioned this meeting a couple weeks back when I stopped by to fix your gutters. Said it was today. I figured you might want some company for something like this." I hadn't specifically asked him to come. I just mentioned it, the way you mention things to people who've made a habit of actually listening, and some old instinct in Jason had apparently filed it away and shown up anyway. The same instinct that had him showing up for 15 years running. "Where's Kyle?" Jason asked, glancing at the empty chair beside me. "Working," I said. Jason didn't press. He just nodded slowly, the way people do when they already understand more than they're saying, and he pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. "So, what are we planning today?" I told him instead. I walked through Ed's catalog with Jason sitting beside me, discussing hymns, discussing the department honor guard I hoped would be present, discussing a graveside service under the same oak tree where Nancy was already buried. Ed took careful notes, occasionally glancing at the empty chair across the table, the one with a small folder already prepared with Kyle's name on it, untouched. Toward the end of the meeting, Ed brought up one detail I hadn't fully decided yet. "Tom, you mentioned wanting to include something about your fire service career in the program. Any specific citation you'd like read?" I thought about it for a long moment, and then, without fully planning to say it out loud, I said, "I'd like Mike Cole's name mentioned, and I'd like Jason to have the option to speak, if he's willing." Jason's eyes went wet, though he tried not to show it. "I'd be honored, Captain." Ed made the note. I looked at the empty chair across that table, the one meant for my son, and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. Something closer to a quiet, exhausted clarity about exactly how much space Kyle currently occupied in the most important conversations of my remaining years. I drove home from that meeting, more resolved than I'd been in months, about the decisions Sandra and I had been quietly working through. I don't want to pretend that meeting alone made up my mind about the will. The decisions about Jason's trusteeship, about the memorial fund, had been developing over the better part of a year already. But that empty chair confirmed something I think I'd been needing confirmed, that whatever love Kyle still carried for me, it had stopped, somewhere along the way. Translating into presence, and presence, I've come to believe more than almost anything else in a long life, is the only currency that actually counts. 3 months later, Kyle sat across Sandra Pierce's desk hearing, for the first time, exactly what that absence had cost him in terms of how I'd chosen to structure my final wishes. I want to be honest that some part of me, sitting in that office watching his face change, felt a complicated mixture of guilt and vindication that I'm not entirely proud of, even now. "Dad, who is this person getting more than $500,000 out of your estate?" I've never even heard that name before in my life. I looked at my son across that desk, and I understood, in that moment, that everything I was about to explain to him should have been explained years earlier. In 100 smaller conversations I'd let slide instead, because I'd assumed there would always be more time to have them. "His name is Jason," I said quietly. "His father died saving my life 20 years ago, and I've been keeping a promise to that man ever since. One I don't regret for a single second, even knowing how this moment was going to land on you." Kyle sat back in his chair, his jaw tight. "You skipped telling me about this the same way you've apparently been skipping, telling me about a whole life I never knew existed. I invited you to a meeting 3 months ago, specifically to start that conversation," I said, keeping my voice as even as I could manage. "You canceled with 20 minutes notice, Kyle." Jason showed up in your place, the same as he's shown up for 15 years running, and some of what got discussed that day is reflected in what Sandra just read you. That's not fair, Dad. That was one meeting. A work emergency. It wasn't one meeting, I said. It was the latest in about a decade of them. Sandra, watching this unfold from behind her desk, with the practiced neutrality of a woman who had seen this exact scene play out 100 different ways, quietly closed her folder and gave us both a moment. I need some time, Kyle finally said, standing abruptly. I don't even know what this is, Dad. You're telling me some stranger is getting $500,000 in control over some fund I've never heard of, and I'm the one finding out about it in a lawyer's office. You're not a stranger to this, Kyle. You've just chosen for a long time now not to be present for it. He left without saying goodbye, and I sat in that office for a long moment afterward, Sandra quietly refilling my water glass without being asked, the way people do when they understand a silence needs tending to more than words do. The weeks that followed were harder than almost anything I'd been through since Nancy's stroke, harder even, in some ways, than the aftermath of Melrose Avenue, because that recovery at least came with a clear physical shape to it, something doctors could measure and treat. This was messier, an ache that didn't show up on any scan. Kyle didn't call for almost 3 weeks. I spent most of those evenings sitting on my back porch, the same porch where Nancy and I used to sit through 30-some years of Cincinnati summers, wondering if I'd finally pushed my son far enough away that there wasn't a path back from it. Vanessa called instead, about 10 days into that silence, her voice tight and controlled in a way that told me she'd rehearsed at least part of what she was about to say. Tom, I think you need to understand how devastating this has been for Kyle. He's been questioning everything, his whole relationship with you, whether you ever actually respected the life he built for your family. I've never once questioned that Kyle built a good life, I said carefully. This isn't about respect for his career, Vanessa. It's about a debt I've owed a family for 20 years and a promise I made on crutches at a funeral before Kyle was even old enough to understand what it meant. But you didn't tell him, Tom. You let him find out from a lawyer, in a room, without any warning. I invited him to a meeting 3 months earlier, specifically to start explaining this in person, I said. He canceled with 20 minutes notice for a work call. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I wondered if she'd known that detail at all before I mentioned it. I didn't realize that was the same meeting, she finally admitted. It was. That still doesn't make this easy for him to process, Tom. $500,000 to someone he's never met. He's met Jason a handful of times over the years, at cookouts, growing up, I said. They just haven't stayed close, the way some childhood friendships don't. That's not the same as never meeting him. And Vanessa, I need you to understand something too. I'm not looking for either of you to simply accept this without any feelings about it. I'm looking for both of you to understand where it actually came from, before you decide how you feel about it permanently. She didn't have much of a response to that, and we hung up not long after in a place that felt, much like my conversation with Kyle 3 weeks earlier, more unfinished than resolved. Jason, for his part, was carrying a guilt I never asked him to carry. He showed up at my house one evening during that stretch of silence, looking as unsettled as I'd seen him since his father's funeral 2 decades earlier. Captain, I think I need to talk to Kyle myself, or maybe I should ask you to change the will. I don't want to be the reason your family falls apart. You're not the reason, Jason. You're the reason I got to keep living the last 20 years at all. Kyle's reasons for being upset belong to Kyle and me, and they go back a lot further than a memorial fund. He's still your son, he is. And you're still Mike's son, and I made your father a promise at his funeral that I intend to keep whether Kyle understands it yet or not. I put my hand on his shoulder, the same gesture I'd been giving him since he was 17 years old, wearing a suit 2 sizes too big. This was never meant to be a competition between the two of you. I don't think I ever explained that clearly enough to either one of you, and that part's on me. I keep thinking about that meeting at Ed's, Jason said quietly. I wanted to say something. Tell Ed to wait for Kyle, push it back a week. I didn't because it felt like it wasn't my place to insert myself into that. I know, I told him, and I appreciated you being there regardless. That mattered more than you probably realize, especially that particular week. Kyle finally called on a Sunday evening, almost a month after our conversation, in Sandra's office. His voice sounded exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with anger anymore, at least not the sharp kind he'd carried out of that office. Dad, can we talk? In person. Can I come by this weekend? He arrived alone that Saturday without Vanessa, and we sat together on my back porch, the same porch where he used to catch fireflies as a boy while Nancy and I drank coffee and watched the summer evenings turn to dusk. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked out at the yard. "I've been sitting with something uncomfortable," he finally said. "The angrier I got about all of this, the more I kept circling back to that meeting at the funeral home. I told myself it was one bad day, one unavoidable work emergency. But if I'm honest with myself, Dad, that wasn't really an emergency. I could have stepped out for 20 minutes. I chose not to because some part of me had already decided, without really thinking about it, that a funeral planning meeting wasn't as urgent as whatever was happening on my screen that afternoon." I didn't say anything, just let him keep going, because I could tell he needed to reach the rest of it on his own. The same way Whitney once had, the same way most people eventually do when they're finally ready to look honestly at themselves. "And I think," Kyle continued, his voice catching now, "some part of me has been doing that for years, treating every visit, every call, every one of these moments like they'd always be there to reschedule. And then I found out in that office that you'd actually been planning for the possibility that they wouldn't be. And instead of understanding what that meant, my first reaction was anger that someone else had shown up for the exact things I kept rescheduling. I appreciated you saying that," I told him quietly. "But Kyle, I need you to understand something too. I don't regret the decisions in that will. I'd make them again, exactly the same way, because Jason's earned every bit of what I've left him, in a way that has nothing to do with how much I love you. What I do regret is not finding a way to explain all of this to you sooner, more clearly, before a lawyer's office had to be the place you heard it first. Why didn't you tell me sooner? The real reason, not the polite one. I thought about how honest to be, and decided, the same way I always eventually decide with the people who matter most, that honesty was the only thing worth offering him. Some part of me wanted to see what you'd do, whether you'd show up for something this important, without me having to chase you down for it first. I'm not proud of that particular motive. It wasn't entirely fair to you, and I've had a lot of long nights since to sit with how unfair it actually was." Kyle nodded slowly, absorbing that. "I think I understand why you might have wanted that, even if it stings to hear. I'd like to meet Jason properly," he said after a while, "not at a cookout when we were kids, and not through a lawyer's folder. Actually meet him as an adult. That happened 2 weeks later at my house. Over a Sunday dinner, I insisted on cooking myself despite Kyle's gentle protests about my heart condition. Jason arrived straight from a shift, still faintly smelling of the station's kitchen, and stood in my doorway a little awkwardly when he saw Kyle already seated at the table. Kyle, it's been a long time." "It has," Kyle said, standing to shake his hand instead of the quick childhood hug they might have exchanged decades earlier. "I owe you an apology, actually. Not for anything specific between us. Just, I think I've spent the last month being angry at you for something that was really about me." Jason sat down slowly. "I never wanted this to come between you and your dad." "It didn't," Kyle said, glancing at me. "Not in the way that matters. It just made me finally look at some things about myself I'd been avoiding for a long time." They talked for almost 2 hours that evening about Mike, about Melrose Avenue, about the strange, complicated inheritance of 2 boys who'd grown up at the same cookouts without ever really becoming close as adults. Jason told Kyle details about his father Kyle had never heard, the deep laugh that filled a room, the fearlessness that both defined and eventually cost him his life. Kyle, in turn, told Jason about growing up with a father who missed birthdays to structure fires, admitting for the first time out loud that some of his own distance over the years had started as a kind of quiet resentment toward a job that had always seemed to matter more than he did. A resentment he'd never fully examined until that exact conversation forced him to. "I used to think the fire department came before me," Kyle admitted at one point. "Watching you talk about my dad tonight, I think I finally understand it wasn't a competition. It was just who he was built to be. I don't think I ever let myself see that clearly before. It wasn't a full reconciliation, not that single evening, but it was honest in a way very little between Kyle and me had been in years, and honest, I've come to believe more than almost anything else in a long life, is the only foundation anything real can actually be built on." Vanessa's apology, when it eventually came a few weeks later, was smaller, more careful, the kind of apology that admits the specific thing without quite reckoning with the pattern underneath it. She told me she was sorry for pushing back so hard on the phone before she understood the full context of the funeral home meeting. she didn't fully address. Not yet anyway. The years of quiet impatience she'd shown at family gatherings, the sighing glances at her watch during visits, the subtle ways she'd made clear over the years that time with me was an obligation squeezed between more important things. I accepted what she offered, because a partial apology honestly given is still worth more than a full one performed for an audience, and because I'd rather build something slow and real than demand something fast and hollow. Over the following months, Kyle started showing up in ways he hadn't in years. He came to my cardiology appointments, sitting in the waiting room without being asked, taking notes on what the doctor said, so he could ask follow-up questions later, the way I imagine he once did for his most valuable clients without a second thought. He started calling every Sunday morning, not to ask for anything, not to explain himself, simply to ask how I was feeling, whether I'd taken my medications, whether I needed anything from the hardware store. At first, I wondered whether guilt was doing the talking. But guilt, I've learned, usually gets tired eventually. Consistency doesn't. One Sunday call became two became a dozen. The calls kept coming. Jason invited Kyle to visit Engine 14 one Saturday, a slow shift with time for a proper tour, and Kyle spent an entire afternoon there, sitting in the same kitchen where his father and Mike Cole used to cook for the crew decades earlier, listening to the current firefighters tell stories about Captain Bradshaw's reputation. Stories Kyle had apparently never heard in any real detail before. One older firefighter, a lieutenant named Ortiz, who'd worked under me in my final years before retirement, told Kyle about the night I stayed at the station 3 extra hours during a blizzard to make sure 2 young rookies got home safely, instead of driving in whiteout conditions. Another told him about the funeral collections I'd quietly organized for 2 different firefighters' families over the years, long before Jason's father died, back when I was still active duty myself. I didn't know any of that. Kyle admitted to me that evening, sitting on my back porch again, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard from him in years. I grew up resenting the job for taking you away from birthdays. I never once asked what the job was actually giving to other people while it was taking you away from me. It gave and it took in equal measure, I told him. That's the honest truth of it. I don't think either version cancels the other one out. The following spring, Cincinnati Fire Department held its annual memorial ceremony honoring firefighters hided in the line of duty, a modest gathering compared to some of the larger department events held at a small memorial garden behind headquarters with a granite wall listing every name going back over a century. Mike Cole's name had been on that wall for 20 years. This particular year, the department was adding a small plaque beside the wall announcing the newly established Michael Cole Memorial Fund for firefighters' families, funded through the trust I'd set up, and now formally activated ahead of schedule since Sandra and I had structured part of the fund to begin operating during my lifetime rather than waiting entirely for my passing. Jason spoke at that ceremony, the same way he'd agreed to speak at my own eventual funeral service, standing at a small podium in front of maybe 80 people, current firefighters, retirees, family members of the fallen. My father used to tell me that the job wasn't about being fearless, Jason said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly underneath it. It was about deciding, every single time, that someone else's life mattered enough to risk your own for it. He made that decision one more time than he had chances left to make it. Captain Bradshaw has spent every year since making sure that decision meant something beyond just my family's grief. Today, because of him, it means something for every firefighter family in this department who ever finds themselves facing what mine faced 20 years ago. I sat in the small crowd that day with Kyle beside me, an arrangement neither of us had planned, but that felt, by that point, entirely natural. When Jason finished speaking, Kyle reached over and gripped my hand, the same way I imagine sons have gripped their father's hands at moments like that for as long as fire departments have existed. "I'm proud of you, Dad," he said quietly. "I don't think I've said that plainly enough in a long time. You're saying it now," I told him. "That's what actually counts." After the ceremony, Denise Cole, Jason's mother, now in her late 60s, found me near the memorial wall and took both my hands in hers. "Tom, I don't think I ever properly thanked you, all these years, for everything you did for Jason. I was so deep in my own grief back then, I don't think I saw clearly enough how much you were carrying his father's memory for both of us. He carried plenty of it himself," I told her. "I just made sure he never had to carry it entirely alone." Kyle stood a short distance away during that exchange, watching, and I noticed something shift in his face while he listened. The same kind of understanding I'd watched settle into Whitney's expression at a hardware store's 45th anniversary in a story that isn't quite this one, but rhymes with it in every way that matters. That summer, Kyle asked if he could help formalize some of the administrative structure around the memorial fund, offering his professional expertise in a way I hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. He spent several weekends with Jason and Sandra, setting up a proper financial oversight structure for the fund, ensuring it would remain sustainable and well-managed for decades beyond either of our lifetimes. Consider it my way of finally showing up for something that actually matters. Kyle told me the first time he mentioned the idea, he and Jason grew genuinely close over those months. Not the forced closeness of two men trying to fix a family rift, but something real, built slowly out of shared work and shared history. Neither of them had fully understood until circumstances forced them to look at it clearly together. They started meeting for lunch occasionally, without me, two men in their 40s finding a friendship in adulthood that their childhood proximity had never quite delivered. My cardiologist, at my most recent checkup, told me my condition had stabilized more than she'd initially expected. Not a cure by any means, but enough improvement in my numbers that she used the word encouraging for the first time since the original diagnosis. I don't know how many more years that gives me. Nobody in my position ever really knows that for certain. But I know I have more of them now, both in terms of health and in terms of the family actually showing up for those years, than I believed I had 18 months ago, sitting alone in that funeral home conference room with an empty chair across the table. Last month, Kyle came to Sunday dinner and brought his own contribution to the evening for the first time in longer than I could remember. Not takeout, an actual dish he'd learned to make, from a cookbook of his mother's he'd found while helping me clean out a closet. He stood in my kitchen in an apron that used to be Nancy's, laughing about something with Jason, who I'd also invited, the way I'd always intended to from the beginning of these dinners. It wasn't a lawyer's office, and nobody was reading anything out loud from a folder. But it was, for the first time in longer than I could remember, an evening where nobody in that house felt like they had to apologize for the life that had actually built it, or the promises that had shaped it. I sat in my usual chair at that table, watching my son and my late partner's son laugh together over something in the kitchen. And I understood something I don't think I'd have understood as clearly without that afternoon in Sandra Pierce's office, forcing all of it into the open. A will was never really about a house, or a trust, or a memorial fund. It was about who actually shows up, year after year, without needing to be reminded that showing up is the whole point. Kyle is still learning that lesson, later than I might have liked, but learning it fully, in a way that matters more to me now than any inheritance ever could. Jason learned it a long time ago, the same way his father taught it to me, without ever once having to say it out loud. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life whose presence you've been quietly taking for granted, assuming there would always be another chance to show up properly, maybe it's worth having the honest conversation before a lawyer's office or a funeral home's empty chair has to have it for you instead. And if this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more true stories about family, sacrifice, and the people who show up when it actually counts.